Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. My name is Meredith Ward, and I'm on the clergy team here. And on behalf of all of us, it is my delight to welcome you to the forum where each Sunday we have sacred conversations about the things that matter. This morning, I am absolutely delighted to welcome Minette Norman, author of this new book, The Boldly Inclusive Leader, which explores how to foster inclusion in our workplaces, communities, and everyday lives. Before writing the book, Minette spent decades leading global technical teams in the software industry. And before that, she has been a very dear friend of mine since freshman year in college. So, Minette, it's wonderful to have you here. Welcome.
It's wonderful to be here with you.
So, you've written this book, which just came out in August.
Yes.
That's kind of a guidebook for becoming a boldly inclusive leader in the workplace. And it's based on a little bit on your own experience. But the skills you talk about are things that all of us can do in our lives to practice more inclusion. Tell us about your own background, your own experience, and why you wrote this book now.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And it's funny that you mentioned that it can be used in our lives in general. I really did write this as a leadership book for the workplace, and only afterwards realized that it is broadly applicable. So how I came to write this book, as you know, so Meredith and I went to college together. I studied drama and French, and I didn't plan for a career in tech or a career as an author. I thought I would be an actor. But then when I was here in New York in the 80s, realized how hard it is to be an actor. I found another job at the French Trade Commission here in New York City, and it was when they introduced computers in the mid-'80s, and I realized I was good at using computers and helping others learn how to use the software. And that's what led me to Silicon Valley. I moved to California in the late 80s. I got my first job in Adobe when they were working on version 1.0 of Photoshop. And I wrote the Photoshop 1.0 tutorial back in 1990. And then I spent the next 30 years in the software industry, and starting out as an individual contributor, but then very quickly moving into management and increasingly larger leadership roles. And like many people, you're good at one thing, and this is so typical in the workplace. I was a good technical writer, they made me a manager, with little to no preparation for that. You know, one day I was writing, and the next day I had 5 people reporting to me. And I realized what a huge responsibility that is, and that you can't just manage everyone in the same way, because we are all so unique as individuals, and people react differently. And so I felt like those next, I would say probably I did 10 years as an individual contributor and 20 years in leadership roles. Those 20 years, I got a huge education in leadership, but also in human interaction and collaboration and listening and empathy and inclusion and all the things that we now talk about that we didn't really talk about 20 years ago. And the last 5 years in my role in tech, I had a very large role. I was a VP of engineering. I had about 1,000 people reporting to me, and I had to influence another 3,500. So it was a very big role. And I realized, now I have a position of influence and power to some degree, and I'm going to use this to do as much good as I can. And for me, it wasn't about engineering, it was about culture change and really giving sort of an example of a new model of leadership that was human and empathetic and compassionate, which I didn't see a lot of in my career, honestly. And at the same time of having power and privilege, I was also a little bit of an outsider, always. And it was intangible reasons. One, you know, being a woman in tech, I was often the only woman in the room. But 2, I was also the liberal artist surrounded by engineers, and always felt slightly different. Like I'm not quite in the insiders club. And I was not alone. I realized how many people feel other. How many people feel they do not fit in, and they're not part of this dominant majority that has all the influence a little bit on the outside. And I realized we need to change this, because people are suffering. People are suffering by being excluded, by feeling they don't belong. And one of the things that I learned while I was doing all this work is that when we feel excluded, this is neuroscience, we experience pain. And our brains do not distinguish between physical pain and social or emotional pain. So all of us who feel like we're excluded, like we don't quite fit in, we're suffering. And I felt like I want to write a book to help leaders not have to learn this for 20 years, but actually dive right in, even if it's the first time managing people, and understand how to bring out the best so that everyone feels that they belong, they're invited to the conversation, and they can fully participate and feel inside rather than outside.
Well, that's amazing. That's an amazing evolution that you're describing, and you recognized it from your own sense of yourself. One of the very first things you talk about in your opening chapter is that good leaders are self-aware. How does that work? And talk a little bit more about that.
Well, the reason I think that's so important, and where I started early in the book about that, is that if you're in any kind of a leadership position, and I use that term broadly, right, because we can all be leaders in certain ways, people are watching you. They're watching everything that you do. And I realized that even the minute I started managing people, they're watching what I react to, what I respond to, and what I ignore. They're watching what you reward and what you punish, what you tolerate, what you communicate, and what you stay silent about. And all these things you are doing often unconsciously. And what I saw a lot is leaders really sending a terrible message of exclusion, for example. Like, I am only paying attention to the people who are just like me, right? I remember this in a company where I worked, where all the insiders had gone to the same university, they had the same socioeconomic background, they had the same ways of thinking, and they were the inside club. And they got all the attention and all the opportunities. And everyone else was kind of like off on the periphery. And so that's the message that was being sent, that unless you're one of us, you don't count. And so being self-aware means knowing how you're showing up and being deliberate about what you communicate, how you listen, how you respond. And it really does start with some introspection and paying attention to our everyday behavior.
Well, you also talk about naming emotions and our limited vocabulary that we use for our emotional lives. And I think, you even put a chart in the book about sort of the varieties of emotions that we can experience under certain headings. What is it about naming emotions that helps us sort of connect with ourselves and with people?
Yeah, and that's work I referenced from an author named Susan David, if anyone knows of her work called Emotional Intelligence. You know, the idea is that we often think when we go to a professional setting, and I don't know if this is true in the church, but certainly in tech, if you go to work, you're supposed to sort of shut down your emotions. Like, you put on your professional facade and show up with that face. But the reality is we are human, and our emotions do not go away when we go to work or anywhere else. And if we do not, and this is based on Susan David's research also, if we do not know what our emotions are, they often get the better of us, right? And so if we're angry or frustrated or feeling shamed or whatever it is, we often will react in an outburst or something because we weren't really aware of what was going on. And so by naming those emotions and getting more in touch with what's actually going on with us, we are better able to decide how to respond rather than to react automatically. And so for one example of this, and this is something that's so common for all of us as human beings, is we get defensive. We get challenged, we get defensive. And that's, again, our brain going into high gear because our brain doesn't distinguish between a social attack and a physical attack, right? So we're in that defensive mode. So if we're not aware that we're getting defensive, what usually happens, we're in fight, flight, freeze mode. And often, if you get attacked, you fight back and you attack back, and then it gets into this very negative cycle. But if instead I can be self-aware, and I can go, uh-oh, I am getting really defensive now, like my heart's racing, my face is red. I can pause, and I can have a response that is more positive, more curious, to know more and not to engage in sort of a battle there. That's one example of getting self-aware. But it can be any emotion, and one of the things that's so interesting, when you said we have a limited vocabulary, I think that there was some research done that most of us can name like 3 to 5 emotions. And that's why I included that chart of maybe 30 emotions, because getting more in touch with what am I actually feeling can really help us figure out now how do I want to respond and what might change that. And in the workplace, when we aren't aware of that, there's lots of bad reactions and behavior that happens.
Right. Well, so if we're going to embark on this work, whether we're leaders in our workplace or we're just in our day-to-day lives, a lot of us have feelings of sort of anxiety and trepidation sort of starting to do this, and there's a lot of discomfort that people feel. It's because it's easy to get paralyzed because you're afraid of making a mistake.
Yeah.
So what can we do to get beyond being paralyzed so that we can at least make an attempt, worry less about making mistakes, and trying to take the next step?
It's a big problem. It really is. And I see this a lot with my work with leaders. And it's also partially, as I said before, with leaders, we think we have to be perfect and we have to have this facade of control. And so stepping into unknown territory, like I am going to work on becoming a more inclusive and empathetic leader, is really out of most of our comfort zones. And it's out of most of what we learned and been trained in school, et cetera. So of course we're uncomfortable. And there's especially when you start, I know you've had speakers here talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion and all that goes into that. And these are huge topics. And we can't be experts in all aspects of them, and yet leaders want to be experts in what they do. So that's normal to have that discomfort. And what I encourage in all my work with leaders at any level is just acknowledge and embrace that it is going to be messy and it is going to be uncomfortable. And it's important to step forward into the discomfort rather than retreating and being so scared that we're paralyzed and we do nothing. Because this work is really important. As I said, people are suffering. And so we have to take these small steps, even if we do have missteps along the way. And I've made them myself. I give a lot of talks and workshops, and I will use, for example, language occasionally that I haven't learned the new, because language is evolving too, and someone will then say, you talked about gender in a binary way, and you didn't, for example, talk about non-binary people, so that was not inclusive. And I got called out on that. Of course, that's uncomfortable. I'm the speaker, and I got called out, and I'm say, thank you. Thank you for educating me and calling out my own bias and my own narrow way of seeing the world. And now next time I will always encourage, use not just binary language. It's uncomfortable, and yet that's how we learn. And there's a really great quote I always love from the former CEO of IBM, Ginny Rometty, and she said, "Growth and comfort do not coexist." And I really love that. And I just try to remind myself of that when I'm getting a little stuck and I'm feeling like, oh, this is hard. This is really hard. And then it's like, well, are we going to keep growing or are we going to stagnate here?
Right.
And I want to keep growing, and I want all the people I work with to keep growing and evolving too.
And if we're going to make these changes, we all have to be a part of it. I mean, it can't just be the work of one group or one demographic or just the leaders or just the workers. It has to be all of us. And if it's going to be all of us, it means we're going to make mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things I loved about that you included in the book is your leadership mantra, which is, we are all works in progress. And I find that really comforting to sort of walk into a situation understanding that we are all works in progress and we're going to make mistakes.
I can't say that enough because we really do feel like we have to be on top of it always, and yet we are all human. And I really believe the more we can acknowledge our shared humanity and be somewhat forgiving of other mistakes and apologize when we do make them and really genuinely apologize, then we're going to all just create a better environment for everybody. And so I believe in it. And it's hard, and then you beat yourself up when you do make a mistake, and you can get into that negative cycle. And I have to do this work myself of just remember, it's just one step back and one step further, and you keep moving, right? Just not to get stuck.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we're all sort of coming at this from our own life experience, which is not necessarily the life experience of the people we work with or the people we are surrounded by. You have a whole chapter devoted to learning to listen, which I really enjoyed and found it incredibly fascinating. You call it listening an inclusive leader's superpower. What are some of the things that keep us, and I think this is really something for all of us to pay attention to, whether we're listening to our partners or our friends or our coworkers or the folks in coffee hour here. What are some of the things that keep us from truly listening, and how do we become better listeners?
There are a few things that typically keep us from listening, and one is we get distracted, right? We have all these devices, we have all these things going on in our world, and it's really tempting to just have our attention pulled somewhere else. So that's the most simple, really. And we can, try to put the devices away and really try to keep our attention. But one thing that's very insidious that keeps us from truly listening is that when we hear someone say something, if it prompts a thought in our heads, we immediately start preparing our response. You just say something to me and I'm like, oh no, that's wrong. I've got to say this, that, and the other. And all the while I'm preparing that, I have stopped listening. And so we have to really consciously trying not to prepare the response, because we're just doing that automatically. Staying present. One of the things, it's funny, when I said when I first became a manager, I got almost no training. One of the only classes I did get was something called Communication Success Skills, and they teach you active listening. And this was like 20 years ago I took this class. And you say things like, I think I heard you say this. Did I understand that correctly? And it felt really awkward and silly when I first heard it. And then I realized this is really important, because we also think we've understood the other person and we make assumptions, but often we're missing what they're trying to say. So I do think it's very useful to go back and check for understanding. Instead of preparing our response and thinking they're wrong, like, let me make sure I got this. Is this what you're saying? And then when you've truly heard them, and by the way, then they feel good. They feel heard, and we all want to be heard. We all want to feel heard. So you've heard them, and then maybe if you disagree, for example, which is fine, you can say, I see things a little differently. Can I share my thoughts now? But you haven't shut them down, you haven't ignored them, you've acknowledged them, you've made them feel seen and heard, and then you can get into dialogue. So that to me is just so critical, and we all think we're good listeners. And we're often not. And I put myself in that camp too, because I'll get distracted or I'll be preparing my response. And then the other thing, which I already mentioned, is then when we are really inviting true listening and we're trying to be curious, we will get challenged. Right. And people will have completely different ways of seeing the world, and you will not agree with them. And that's when that defensive thing I already mentioned, that's one of our reactions. And I think here what's so important is that we can disagree, but we don't have to attack. We can listen with curiosity and still offer our own point of view. And so that's why I believe it's such a superpower in leadership, because everyone, really when I think about inclusion in general, I think about maybe the essence of inclusion is being heard, seen, respected, and valued for who you are. And if you are listened to in that way, I think that goes a long way toward feeling like you count, you're part of this, you're not on the outside, you're not being discounted. And that's why I think we can't underestimate the power of listening.
You mentioned getting curious, and we often are surrounded by people that we don't know, come from different backgrounds from ourselves, or we just simply don't connect with them for whatever reason. And it seems to me that, and you make this point in the book, that curiosity about other people is a really important stance to take. How can that help us, both in the listening and in the getting defensive, and just in general broadening our horizons?
Well, what curiosity does is it takes us out of judgment. And I think there's studies about this, like you can't be judgmental if you're curious, like they can't coexist. And what happens is that we, as a species, are drawn to people who are most like us. That's basically our biology, it's how we've survived. And so we naturally connect with the people who think like us and who agree with us. And I've often heard the term, I like to be with like-minded people. And that's natural. And yet you're going to find yourself with people who are not like-minded, especially in a workplace where you don't necessarily, you haven't picked everyone who's there, for example. And so curiosity can bridge those natural gaps where this person has a totally different background, we don't see the world the same way, but I'm going to get really curious to learn something about them. I'm going to learn something about their life that I might not know. I'm going to learn maybe that there's something we have in common that we didn't know. And suddenly, again, there's that shared humanity that yeah, you're from a totally different walk of life. You and I are politically perhaps very different, and yet we both love our families, right? And then you just suddenly find some common ground, and it makes it so much easier to interact, whether personally or professionally. And in the workplace, obviously, today we do not work alone. Like everything is done in groups and teams. And so there will be friction, and yet we still need to work together. So bridging those gaps, getting curious to learn something about someone else. Maybe you have a common sense of humor. Whatever it is, it helps you connect. And through connection, it makes it so much better to work together, to interact day to day, and it just removes a lot of that friction, even if you totally disagree on a lot of things.
Well, you mentioned earlier when we were talking about emotions, that sense of being yourself, of being authentic, and you asked if this is the case in church. Well, we all do sort of come to church with our Sunday best attitudes on, right? And we sort of present that everything is okay and that we're doing just fine. And actually, things may not be fine. And actually, a little bit later, if those of you who are staying for the 11 o'clock service or who are at the 9 o'clock service heard a wonderful sermon on loneliness from our rector, which is just, at epidemic proportions. But how we feel brave enough, if we're in a leadership position or just in a group of people, to be honest enough to share how we're feeling and how that helps us connect.
Yeah, and it's that fine line, of course, that we have to navigate of not oversharing and making people uncomfortable. Like I've just bared my soul and told you everything, and now I put you in an uncomfortable position. Versus, I am not having the best of days, and I may need a little compassion right now, and I may not be at my best. And being able to share that and feel that there are people around you who care about that, and who are then going to give you some kindness back. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I want to open it up to questions from the audience at this point. If you are in the room, do we have a question card person with us this morning? Oh, Conrad, great, thank you. Conrad has question cards, and he will pass them around. If you have a question and you're in the room, just raise your hand, and he will give you the card, and we'll pass it up here. If you are joining us online, you can put your questions in the chat or in the comments, or you can email them to me at mward@stbarts.org. So while we're waiting for those questions to come in, here's sort of the big sum up question. How do we really ensure that all voices are heard and that people feel safe to speak up?
It is a very big question, and it is critical. I think it's such a foundational question because unless people feel that their voice is welcome and that it will be respected, it's not just, yeah, you can speak, but we're going to ignore you, or we're going to interrupt you, or we're going to talk over you, that your voice is welcome and respected, then we do not feel that we are truly part of this group. And so this term, by the way, what you're referring to is called psychological safety. And psychological safety is the idea that in this group, so it could be, for example, in this group right here, I feel that it is safe for me to ask a question, to not have all the answers, to show up as myself as much as I want to present myself. And I know if I do any of those things, I will not be excluded, I will not be humiliated. I will not be marginalized, and there will be no negative ramifications. So it's so important that we cultivate an environment where people feel invited and welcomed, and that we're going to listen when you speak. And so some of the things we can do, and I think this is, a lot of this goes to the workplace, so we may need to think about how to transfer it to an environment like this, but if you're having a meeting, what happens all too often in meetings is that there are a couple loud voices. Anyone have ever been in a meeting with like two people who monopolize all the airtime? It's very common. And then, right, we've all been in that. And then the other people stay silent. And do you think it's because they don't have anything to say? I don't think so. I've often been that silent person. It's usually because, one, you can't find a way in because the people are talking too much, or because you, when you do speak, maybe get ignored, maybe have someone roll their eyes and be like, oh, that one again, right? The troublemaker or the weird one or whatever it is. And so you don't feel like your voice matters, and therefore it's self-perpetuating in that you'll stay silent now. And so you may have a great, diverse workforce with lots of different perspectives on the world, and you're only hearing from a couple people. And you don't benefit from this, what I would call collective genius that you have, but you're not tapping into that amazing talent because they don't feel their voice is welcome. So we have to deliberately, I mean, I have a whole book on this, a separate book on this, but there are many things we can do. One of them is to just literally invite everyone to speak. So if we were in, let's say we were going to go table by table here, I would say let's go from left to right, and let's very briefly hear from each one of you and invite all the voices that way, and also have time limits so no one can dominate and say, well, we're going to have a 30-second, like just give me your 3 sentences here, and invite everyone. And then make sure that when everyone is heard, that we listen respectfully to them, and that we follow up to make sure that things don't get dropped. So that's one idea. There are a lot, but I think it's just so important that we make sure that every voice is really honored and invited.
That's so important. That seems to happen a little bit in our Zoom meetings, when it seems to happen maybe more easily when we're meeting on Zoom, because we can go around and invite people as opposed to when we're meeting in
physically.
person. Do you find that?
Yeah, I do.
Be
And
the case?
I have actually, ever since we got very good at being virtual in 2020 and until now, I think that the online experience turns out to be often more inclusive than the in-person experience, because in person, it's the big personalities. It's the people who are super confident who do most of the talking. And Zoom or any of those online platforms are a little bit the equalizer. And then we tend, because it's not as easy to break into the conversation because of the lag, we tend to have to do more turn taking. And so I think that's actually good. And we can learn from that in real life as opposed to virtual life, right?
Absolutely. So we have a whole bunch of questions here. Here's a very good one. Is there a good, healthy way to deal with toxicity in the workplace?
And we all let out
a lot
big
of
sigh,
groans.
right? There is so much toxicity in the workplace. Honestly, toxicity in the workplace is why I left the world of tech, which is a much longer story. But the issue is, and I do get this question because, for example, I may be dealing with someone who is a leader, but is not at the most senior level in an organization. And they have power and influence over their area, and they can create a great working experience for their employees. But they may be reporting to a toxic leader above. And they have the question, what do I do? And the question is there any way to influence? I always ask, can you have any conversations? Is there any possibility of openness and change? And sometimes yes, sometimes we just haven't had those courageous conversations and said, I'm really suffering here. This is not working for me. Or you may be dealing with, and I'm not going to name names because I just thought of a toxic leader who's in the news all the time, but I'll leave that name out, but you can imagine who that is. There may be a person who just you cannot change because they think they know everything. And then the question I always have is, can you still operate in a way that is somewhat positive for you and your team members and your colleagues, or is it taking too large a toll on you? And that's really a question we can only answer individually. If it's taking a terrible emotional, physical toll on you, then you do have to think about, getting out and going somewhere else, because suffering like that long term is going to be very, very detrimental. And it's unfortunate. I would say there is a lot of toxicity, and I don't think all of it is impossible to change. I think some of it is really deep, leaders who are not self-aware of what they're doing, and I do think coaching and training can help. And then I think there's some that are beyond hope. But I don't think they're all like that.
Right. So there is hope.
I believe there's hope. I have to remain optimistic, and that's why I do this work. I think that change is possible, not for everybody, but for many of us. Mm-hmm. And I've seen it, so I'm not just making it up and living in my head. I think it's possible, but it takes work and it takes willingness.
Right.
Yeah.
Willingness. Good one.
Yeah.
Here's a question from someone in the room. Do you have tips to offer from your experience regarding hiring practices that can contribute to creating and maintaining a more inclusive work environment?
Well, certainly there's been a lot on this in recent years. Is like, how do we actually attract and invite a more diverse workplace? And it's diversity in all its forms. So not just race and gender, but ways of thinking, neurodiversity, et cetera. And one of the ways that's quite interesting that it turns out is that even in the way we write our job descriptions can either be inviting and inclusive or a turnoff. And so if that's, whoever wrote that question, if that's of interest, certainly look up inclusive job postings, because language matters in how we describe things. There, especially in the tech world, there'll be lots of words like, we want a ninja who codes, and that, I mean, I've seen job ads like that. And who that attracts is the demographic that you usually see, right? The white male engineer. And that's going to be a turnoff to many other people, because I don't consider myself a ninja, whatever it is, right? And it's offensive to many people as well. So we have to be really inclusive in our language. And then how we interview is really important, because there are a lot of interview techniques that turn out not to be very inclusive. And some of these were, again, in the tech world, I just come back to these examples I know, where they would ask people to solve problems in real time or do coding tests in real time. And not everyone does well in real time, and they need time on their own. They would be great at doing this in their own time. But so we need to change how we do these interviews. And then it also can't be as subjective as it used to be, where people would say, oh, this person will be a great fit, because that is coded language for they're just like us. And we don't want a fit. We want someone who's going to add something new. And so we have to be really careful when we have these hiring conversations. It's like, well, I don't think Meredith's going to fit in here. And then for someone to challenge that and say, what are you saying here? What is it about Meredith? And dig deeper. And what are we really talking about? And expose that bias, because it's there. We just have to start talking about it, realizing it, and challenging it. So this is a big topic as well. Again, I could talk all day, but I know we don't have that much time.
Well, we still have time.
We still have time, okay.
We still have time.
Good.
So here's a really interesting question from one of our online viewers who spent 30 plus years in IT. And is expressing appreciation for your very wise advice. This person was often a team lead, responsible for technical oversight, but had no real quote-unquote power to affect how team members felt, included in the department's oversight and management. Management above this person set those terms. This person asks, is my listening enough? Do I take these concerns above me, hoping they'll listen, advocate for change? Is listening actively to my managers enough?
What a big question.
Yeah.
Well, I think as a team lead, you are in an interesting position, because you certainly have influence over how people are experiencing work, because you're leading meetings, you're interacting with them. So you can make them feel safe, you can make them feel heard. And I think what I'm getting from this question is, do I have a bigger responsibility, and can I influence? And I think it's certainly worth trying, and I would, because you're seeing people in action. You're seeing what they're good at. You're seeing, maybe their talents that are not being noticed by higher up people. You may see problems also. You may see problem behavior that the management doesn't know about. And I do think it's worth bringing it up. I think you have to find the right people to speak to. Like, obviously find a manager or someone in leadership who may be open to feedback and saying, look, I'm leading all of these meetings. I'm seeing a lot team dynamics. I'm seeing a lot of, fabulous behavior and performance, and I would love to share. And I would do it in a very positive way, so that you're basically sharing good news, but not hiding if there's bad news. And there are also some concerns that I think you want to know about. So if you can make it so that it is a gift to the person you're sharing it with, then I would really expect they would be open to it. And so I would say, even if you don't think you have power, you do. And even if you don't think you have influence, you do.
Good advice. I mean, there's another question related to that, which is if you want to take some of these steps and you are in an environment that just isn't, the entire environment is not welcoming, are there steps that you can take?
This is where I am a little stumped, honestly, because if the statement is true that the entire environment is not welcoming, I don't know what you can do.
Yeah.
You can protect your own little bubble. You can do as much work around you as possible. That'll probably be laterally, like maybe with your peers. You might have a good working relationship with your peers, perhaps, although maybe not. Maybe there's a lot of competition, which is unhealthy. If you're a leader or manager, you have great influence over your own staff, and you can have a great experience for them. But if the whole environment is not welcoming and isn't open to anything, you're going to be limited in what you can do. And again, that question, can I still do enough good work here and not suffer too much that I can stay? Or is this just really the wrong place to be? And I also recognize that not everyone can change jobs easily. Right. So we have to figure out how to make it sustainable enough to work in this environment and do whatever good work we can, versus, maybe not being able to change above us and across broadly. Right. Yeah.
So here's someone who says, I'm a big fan of the giving people the benefit of the doubt. How do you think about the calculus of when to give the benefit and when to challenge the other person?
I think it's a good policy to give the benefit of the doubt and to assume people have good intentions. And then you may be surprised one day when someone comes at you in a way that doesn't feel like they are coming with good intentions. And then I do think it's important to speak up and let them know how what they're doing is impacting you. And I think there's also this thing about people, if you say, like, that was really offensive, or that really hurt me when you said that. That felt like you were completely trying to destroy me, and I don't even know how to respond to that. And the other person said, oh, no, I had, my intentions were all good. The thing that happened there is that maybe that person really did have good intentions, but their delivery may have been terrible, and it did have a negative impact on you. And so I think it's important then to speak up and say, whenever we can, what the impact was, to let the other person know that even if their intentions are good, what they were trying to do didn't land, and that maybe they want to try to do it a little differently the next time. So I do think we can give the benefit of the doubt, and most times that's going to work in our favor, but sometimes it won't. And then I think we can't let every single we don't want to call out every single little thing, because then we're just attacking all the time. But if something has a really profoundly harmful impact on us, then I think we should let the other person know.
And I think it sort of also goes to your point, the point you made earlier about not being afraid of making mistakes ourselves, or knowing that we will make mistakes, and also, offering grace to other people who will make mistakes also. Yes. That we're all making mistakes together and learning together. This is new information for a lot of people, and to give grace where we can.
I totally agree with you. I think it goes, it's very interesting. There's, was it the Jimmy Kimmel thing in the news recently, right? About toxic behavior, and the way he even apologized was not so great, because he said, I'm sorry if I offended you, or something like that. And the if, it's just a very small word, but the if challenges the person who was offended, like, I didn't really offend you, or I might not have. I'm sorry if I offended you. And it kind of makes the other person then feel defensive. So it's what we really want is just a genuine apology. I am really sorry. Right. You can leave off the rest of it. this is, I am really, really sorry. And leave off the if, because then the if is like, yeah, maybe not. Maybe I didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah.
And so the genuine apology, and then as you said, we give grace.
Right.
I accept the apology. We're all trying to do better.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So we have, I think, time for like one or two more questions, but here's one, and this is sort of, maybe you can't answer this question, but we know a lot of leaders who are not boldly inclusive, who are very successful.
Yes.
How do we find and seek out and support leaders who are boldly inclusive or are trying to change and become boldly inclusive and ensure the success of that kind of leadership?
Well, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. There are a lot.
That's
what this book is about. There are a lot of leaders who have succeeded despite being pretty awful human beings and not really caring about the people in their organizations. And yet I actually believe the majority of people want to do right by the people in their organizations and want to be better. And so I think those are the ones that we are drawn to, and we try to encourage, and we want to elevate, and we want to get their message out there as well, so that we don't only highlight in the news the toxic leaders who are running these large corporations, but what about the people that are maybe the next level down, who are the aspiring, fabulously, boldly inclusive leaders. So I think we have to find them, work with them, and that's the work I'm doing, and many other people are doing this work, which I think is important. And honestly, my goal is to make this kind of leadership, boldly human, inclusive leadership, the new model of leadership everywhere, because I think it's time. I think it's long overdue. I think our models of leadership that we've seen are no longer serving people. They're no longer serving organizations or society or the world. And I think we need to flip that on its head and say the new leader for this century and beyond is human, is inclusive, is bold, is going to challenge the status quo and say we're not going to tolerate these old models anymore. And so the more people doing that, that's how we drive change.
You're going around the country speaking to corporate leaders, you're speaking to some government organizations, you're speaking to a variety of organizations. And I wonder, in those meetings, when you go out and speak to leaders around the country, does that opportunity open up space for people to, for employees and leaders alike to kind of begin that conversation?
Yes, exactly. So I also know that, because I do these, and now it's beyond the U.S. I've done stuff in Asia now, in Europe, so it's not just the U.S., which is great. It's so basically a talk or a workshop that may be 1 hour or 90 minutes is only an opening. It's like a conversation starter. And then what I often leave behind is I leave behind these discussion guides. So you can do this work. You don't need me to be in there all the time. But please continue the work because it's a practice. And I also talk about that a lot in the book. It's not a flip of a switch, right? We have to do this work. We have to practice. And so the more you can actually bring it into all your conversations and your work and your meetings and change things little by little, the more this can be sustained over time. So yeah, I feel like the more opportunities, the better, because we spread the word, just as you spread the word, right? We're trying to make positive change, right?
Yeah. So we are opening up space, making this a practice, not a one-shot deal, and hopefully there will be space for change for the betterment of all.
Yeah.
Right? Thank you, Minette. Thanks for joining us this morning. It's
Thank
been a delight
Meredith.
to have
Thanks
you
for
here.
having me. Thank you all.
Thank you all for joining us this morning. I hope you'll come back next week when we will have Alexandra Petri from the Washington Post. She's going to be with us to talk about her new book, totally different subject, that satirizes American history. She'll be talking about histories, fun facts, and regular facts. So join us next Sunday. If you are here in person, I hope you'll join us for the 11 o'clock service starting shortly, or online. It will be live streamed as well. And we'll see you soon. Thank you very much. Thanks, Minette.